Today we're going to talk about wood. Wood naturally comes from trees. Trees, if you've ever seen a tree sawn down or you've seen the stump, you know that it grows in concentric circles. So each year it grows another circle or grows another layer of bark, which in turn makes the trunk larger and wider. If you've ever stood out and looked at a stump, you can see the circles, and by counting the circles we can know the approximate age of the tree when it was felled. So trees come in two different classifications. They're either hardwoods or they're softwoods. Softwoods come from conifer trees, those trees that have cones and needles and pines. Are usually evergreen types of trees, where hardwoods are a deciduous tree. They're the ones that shed their leaves every season. Now when we fall a tree, we have different things that happen to it. It's a living, breathing organism. So whereas the tree grows and the limbs grow and die or cut off, they leave what's called a knot hole. And where it's attached, and as you can see in this illustration, a knot hole. Wood is graded by its structural use, and the number of knot holes a lot of times is limited to the size, the locations, where this wood is going to be used. This normally you don't see in furniture. Other things we see in wood are called pitch pockets. They're those little openings that contain solid liquid between the annual rings of softwoods, this sap, if you will, what they'll collect. Other things we see in wood are called shakes and checks. Shakes are the separation along the grain, those between the annual circles, where it's quite literally starting to separate between the concentral circles. And checks, quite literally, are split across the rings. Usually happens during the seasonal process, during the shrinking. Now wood grains, what we refer to as a grain, is the appearance of the texture of its pores. Now their grains are classified as either an open grain or a closed grain. It's tight or it's a larger grain between. Sometimes those can be modified with wood fillers. But how we see the grain and the texture is depending on how the wood is cut. Here you see the illustration of 4 different styles of cutting the wood. So we have a plane sawn, which quite literally when the log is cut down, we see that it's cut in different directions to use as much of the log as possible. And you can see the grain pattern in it, as opposed to quarter sawn, where the log is fallen. It's cut into 4 quarters, just like if you were cutting a pie, and then that quarter is cut to get the maximum. Now you can see the difference in the grain between the plane sawn and the quarter sawn. Rift sawn, it's a little different texture, a little different technique you can see in the darker. We'll explain this more. And then live sawn, where they're just cutting straight across. This also sometimes is called plane sawn. So solid wood, usually cut flat, quarter, or rift. Depends on how it was cut, is how the pattern or how the grain looks when we're finished. So we want moisture content wood to be about 30% or below, because wood, to make the tree grow, you water it. And just like any other living plant, that water and that moisture stays within the trunk and in the limbs of the tree. So as we're using it for furniture or construction, we want it to be 30% or less, because it shrinks as it loses moisture. If you've ever seen a fence put up and it was butt to butt when it was put up, and then after a few months you start seeing those gaps between the wood plates, quite literally the moisture content has dried and the wood has shrunk. So it expands and contracts with moisture. So solid wood is used for construction and framing purposes. That's called lumber. We don't use lumber in fine furnishing. We use lumber in construction. So, and then other woods, we'd use thin slices of wood called veneer that's applied to the surface. And usually we do that on furniture, decorative objects, and wall paneling. So when we dry wood, the proper term for drying wood is called kiln. And if it's not drying properly, we get all kinds of distortions, as you can see. It crooks, bows, twists, cups, warps. it's not usable in a lot of aspects. So we want to make sure that the kiln drying is proper. It's after the wood has been cut, it quite literally is stacked on racks and put into what looks like a giant oven. So quite literally it's baked or dried in this large kiln. That's how we want to see the lumber dried. So plain sawn, as we see, this is cut. All the bark is stripped off first, and then it's cut directly across. Usually the grain on this, it has a tendency to wear unevenly. These boards have a tendency to cup and warp. A lot of times when we're using plain sawn, not so much used for furniture, but more for lumber purposes, construction purposes. And we see the quarter sawn, we see a much prettier grain pattern happening when it's cut. And it's cut in these 4 sections. So quite literally the log is cut into 4 sections, and then it's cut diagonally across that section. It gives a more uniform appearance. Where rift sawing, this shows the prettiest grain of the wood, because quite literally it's going with the grain or with the circles of the tree. And you can see on all these little inner spaces, there's also a lot of waste on this. So this is the most expensive way to cut wood, but it does show the prettiest grain to it as well. Now don't think that all this stuff goes to waste, because we don't throw anything away. We use it. And we use it in engineered wood. It's also called composition wood. These are made up of wood strands, wood fibers, wood particles, and then they're either veneered or bonded together with adhesives and heat and pressure. So the advantages of engineered wood over hardwood is that it doesn't have that expansion and contraction as much as solid wood. Solid wood, we don't know what's on the interior portion of it. You don't know what's there until you cut it. With engineered wood, it's already been cut and processed. And as you can see, this is a really good explanation or visual. So you see all these little sections that look like little wafer cookie. Quite literally, these boards are constructed in 90-degree angles to each other, so they don't get that warping or movement across. So quite literally, this engineered wood is a lot stronger than solid. That's why we use it in the understructure of furniture. Thank you.